So, Alec, did you ever have like G.I. Joes or Barbies in your house when you were a kid?
I know exactly where this is going. Are you talking about the similarities between those and hair transplants?
Exactly. More specifically, the hair plugs. Like back in the day, it's probably still the case that I don't have these toys now, but they had these really big plugs that would come out of the dolls' heads. And like that's how these things were actually built. It's part of the whole manufacturing process. The individual plugs are punched into this plastic skull. And, for like 40 years at the dawn of hair transplants, that's pretty much exactly what they look like, except they're on an actual human being.
So when people make that joke about he's got doll hair, it's not really an exaggeration. That's pretty good description.
It's disturbingly precise. It's the same tufted, evenly spaced, like someone punched this in one at a time look. And the textbooks from that era on hair transplants, they called it a doll's head appearance. And that's not a nickname that we're inventing for the show. That's the actual clinical term that surgeons use to describe their own results.
So the pitch to a patient in, let's say, 1975, we can grow your hair back. The underlining statement with that is you're going to look like a toy.
That's really the whole tension that we want to talk about today. So like for decades, the technology to grow your hair back was ahead of the technology that it took to make it look like the hair wasn't gone in the first place.
I feel like people still have that idea. I've had consults where a guy's real fear isn't the surgery itself and any pain involved with that. It's really that he's nervous he's going to end up looking like an action figure.
Which by the end of this episode, we're going to tell you is a completely reasonable fear to have had, like circa 1990, but it's out of date today. So this is the Above the Hairline podcast coming to you from the offices of the Hair Restoration Institute of Minnesota. The mission here is to improve lives and restore confidence through thick, healthy hair. We offer consultations in person and also online. And you can request one of those by going to hrimn.com. I'm Nate Bruschi.
I'm Alec Pershawn, and today Nate's the one in the expert chair because he's going to tell you guys about some really fun stuff. He's the type that likes to read about fun wars that nobody else remembers.
Well, this today, it's not going to be a war, but it's a good story, Alec. It's got Japanese dermatologists. It's got a guy who kept his technique secret out of spite. It's got a Brazilian surgeon who basically invented the whole mega session. So if you stick with me, you're going to hear the whole story.
I'll believe it when I hear it.
Okay, so first up, this isn't a new problem, a hair loss. People have been trying to solve baldness since ancient Egypt. There's actually a hair restoration recipe in the Ebers Papyrus, which is like one of those historical first documents ever existed. But surgical hair transplantation, the thing that we would actually recognize, our story begins in Japan in 1939 with a dermatologist by the name of Dr. Okuda.
I mean, there's no way there was male pattern baldness in 1939, or there was, but there's no market for it. So what was he actually treating?
Exactly. In this case, the Japanese doctor was trying to treat burn patients. And so what he's doing is he's punching out hair-bearing skin and grafting it into burn scars. And then, so that was working. For a few years later than that, another Japanese dermatologist named Dr. Tamura, he actually refined it. So he was using smaller grafts of 1 to 3 hairs, but he wasn't putting it on the head. He was mostly using it to restore pubic hair on female patients after trauma.
So basically, the entire field starts as reconstructive medicine, not cosmetic.
Exactly. And so Tamura's technique, the 1 to 3 graft hair, it's cut from a single strip. It's actually really close to what we consider the state of the art 50 years later. It's kind of interesting how things kind of go back like that. But the work got lost for over a decade. No one really connected it to male pattern hair loss yet.
So who actually connected the dots?
So there's a guy, he has the superb name of Norman Orentrek, and he's in New York in 1952, so a few decades later. This is the first transplant for actual male pattern baldness. Now, he got a lot of pushback at the time that he did this first procedure, and that's because even he accepted what was the general wisdom at the time, and that was that the hair that got transplanted would just fall back out again. This thing was not permanent.
Why would anyone think that?
Well, today we know that hair transplants do last, but at the time, no one had been able to prove that. And so Orentrek's contribution isn't really the surgery, it's the theory behind it, which is known as donor dominance. And this is the idea that hair from the back and the sides of your scalp is genetically resistant to balding, and it stays resistant even after you move it someplace else. That single idea is the entire foundation for every hair transplant that has been done since then.
Okay, so that part holds up, but where does it go wrong?
The execution. So Orentrek's method, he used a 4 millimeter punch, and that's a genuinely big plug. It's about 20 to 30 hairs crammed into a single round graft. For kind of context, like today, the hair transplants that we're doing, they're a 0.7 millimeter graft. So, it's 4 millimeters versus 0.7, so many, many times larger. The reason why that's more challenging is that the blood supply is limited to servicing those grafts. You're kind of limited to about 50 to 100 grafts per session. And that was the standard technique from late 1950s all the way to around the mid 1980s or so.
So there was 30 years of the exact same tool.
30 years. And it grew hair. That part actually worked. The problem was around the naturalness. So you've got round plugs of around 20 plus hairs going in dead straight. They're evenly spaced, and that's where that doll's head Barbie look, comes from. So every joke you've ever heard about when it comes to hair plugs, like this is where that comes from.
Yeah, so they weren't really like describing a myth. I mean, for 30 years, that was pretty accurate. It's not an outdated stereotype. That's an accurate description of what we had for 3 decades.
Correct. Which is why I don't really get annoyed when someone brings up in a consult. They're not actually wrong about history. They're just wrong about how things are today in 2026.
All right. So how do you get from Barbie hair to whatever we're doing now? Because that's a huge gap to close.
It is. And it's not one invention. It's about 15 years of people chasing smaller. So the first attempt, there's a French surgeon named, I think it's Potois. I think that's how you say his name. He's using 2 millimeter grafts in the 1970s. So we're already shrinking the size. This ends up actually being a bad idea because there's a really high transection rate. And that means that you're literally severing the follicles as you cut them, and the grafts just don't grow well.
So just because he made it smaller didn't actually make it better.
Well, not with the tools that they had. Then there's an Australian surgeon. He has a smarter idea. Let's cut the existing 4 millimeter plugs into quarters after the fact. And so this is better. You're still working with like 8 to 12 hairs per grafts. So it still has a little bit of that plugginess. It just is less pluggy.
This is very much an incremental progress episode so far.
It is, but we're going to start speeding it up. So the big breakthrough is when strip graft harvesting shows up. And this is when we cut out thin strips of donor hair with a multi-bladed knife instead of punching the individual plugs. What you have is one linear scar instead of this checkerboard of circular ones. And that's the moment that these sessions really start getting bigger. You see 400 to 800 grafts in a single session. And the reason is you're not limited by how many holes you can punch before the blood supply gives out. It's the kind of transplant that, my dad had back in, when he had his hair transplant. And the idea, back then was you do many of these small sessions. You do like one a year over several years.
Okay, so I kind of see where this is going because earlier you mentioned a mega session. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Right. So then there's a clinic in Vienna, and that really pushes the results. And it has a transplant of more than 1,000 grafts in a single session. And so, for hair nerds, this is like the big moment that we're trying to recognize modern hair transplants. There's a doctor called Rassman who does, tries to up that. He does one with over 3,000 grafts the following year. And then in 1993, because you've had all these different doctors and scientists kind of trying to do their own thing, we got our first professional society, the ISHRS, and that's really designed specifically so people stop reinventing this stuff in isolation and actually start to compare notes.
Okay, so I understand how we got to like more grafts in these procedures, but none of that really solves the fake problem. How do they solve that?
So you're right. And this is like the turning point of the whole thing. So we've been focusing on hair, but not about making it look natural. And ultimately, that's what people want. So in 1984, there's a pathologist named Headington, also kind of funny name to be working in hair. Headington. So he's looking at scalp biopsies under the microscope, and he notices something that no one had really formalized before. And that's that hair doesn't really grow as these like individual strands. It grows in these natural little bundles of 1 to 4 hairs, and he calls them follicular units.
Okay, so the plugs were fighting the actual anatomy the whole time.
I think that's the best way to put it. So every technique before this was deciding somewhat arbitrarily how many hairs to put into one graft. And so follicular unit transplantation says, don't decide that. Just look at how the hair is already grouping in nature, dissect it out under the microscope so you can, do so and not really damage those natural groupings, and you place them just the way that you actually found them.
All right, I'll be impressed if you know this. Who did it first?
Yeah, so that's a great trivia question. There's a Texas surgeon named Bobby Limmer, and he's in 1988. But he doesn't publish his results in 1990 until 1992 because he wants to be sure. And then Bernstein and Rassman, again, two kind of forerunners in the hair restoration space, they write the first paper that actually names and defines what FUT is in 1995. It's not an easy sell. It's a little bit slower. It needs a stereo microscope, so there's more equipment that's there. It needs way more trained staff. And so a lot of the field kind of pushes back because it sounds like a lot of extra work for only marginal improvement.
But it wasn't marginal.
Right. And this is the key thing that's helping is making hair transplants look more natural, which is the whole point of why patients are coming there. So by the year 2000, this is the gold standard, full stop. And this is the honest answer to your kind of title question is like from roughly 2000 onward, when it's done well, hair transplant results have been genuinely undetectable. It's not just pretty good for a hair transplant, it's undetectable.
All right, well, when it's done well is also doing a lot of work in that sense.
Well, we should hold that thought because that's exactly where FUE comes in. And FUE is where this like kind of stops being this clean success story.
It's good. Because I was beginning to think this was just going to be 45 minutes of you telling me everything got better forever.
No, I mean, every good story, there's build up, there's a tension, there's a little bit of a fall. So that's where we are here in this story. So FUT solves a naturalness. It has its own issues. So it doesn't solve the problem of having that linear scar on the very back of your head from that strip session. If you're a guy who wants to wear his head short, that scar becomes a real problem. And so in 1998, people start asking, can we harvest those same follicular units, but instead of doing it all at once in one big group, can we do it one at a time with a tiny punch? And that way we can skip the whole strip entirely.
I mean, that sounds immensely better. What's the catch?
Well, so the first guy to actually pull it off is another Australian named Ray Woods, and he gets it working in the 1990s, and he calls it scarless surgery. Technically there are these micro scars, you don't really see them, but that's how he calls it, scarless. And he keeps the exact method secret from the rest of the field.
So Ray discovers this and just kind of keeps it to himself.
He doesn't tell anyone. The field has to kind of reinvent it, kind of working backwards from what the guy told them. So Rassman and Bernstein, the same duo from FUT, they published the first real paper about it in 2002. And they're upfront that, the early manual extraction has real problems. You're extracting blind. When you're going top down, you don't really see the angle of the follicle under the skin, so the transection rate can be higher and the growth can be less consistent.
So it was kind of like round two of the new thing looked worse than the old thing for a while.
Similar pattern to FUT. It takes about a decade of people refining the punches, adding motors, rotation, oscillation, vibration, and then developing blunt dissection instead of sharp dissection. All that has to happen before FUE really catches up to FUT in reliability. And so by 2015, the industry census data has FUE at over half of the procedures, and that's already up for about 10% in 2009. And then kind of anecdotally, today there's plenty of clinics that don't do any FUT. They only do FUE. FUT is still out there, but it's a much more complicated procedure to do, and there's certain kind of benefits to it.
All right, so it worked. That should be the happy ending to all this.
It should be, but here's my actual concern, and it's current. FUE, because of the technology involved, it made it much more accessible. It actually lowered, the skill floor to enter the hair restoration field. You don't need to have a large surgical team. You don't need to have that kind of facial plastic surgery training for the strip closure skill set. You can, do a strictly FUE only practice and have kind of minimally qualified people doing it. And so the global hair restoration market is now estimated at billions and billions of dollars a year now. And a large chunk of that are these like turnkey practice models that will sell physicians on letting technicians, often with very little training, do the actual extraction and placement. And that's also where the kind of robots come in. They sell these doctors where the promise is, hey, like you don't have to really know how to do a hair transplant. The robot will do the whole thing for you.
Okay, so we kind of solved the issue with the tool not being good enough. Now the tool is fine. It's just the question is who's holding it.
That's precisely it. So the FUE technique isn't the problem. It's that FUE is a low barrier to entry business model, and it's run often by people who have never actually been trained in hair restoration. And so what that has kind of done is it's produced a new wave of these bad outcomes where there's over-harvested donor areas, there's visible dot scarring, there's patchy density, transection, which limits how many grafts will take. It just looks different than that 1985, doll head look. So it's not as instantly recognizable, but it's the same root cause of technique outrunning judgment. And so now let's take a quick break. And this one's actually relevant for what we're talking about. What we want to talk about is if you are looking at hair restoration, if you're not in the Twin Cities, here we have a great program called Hair by Air. And so if you've been putting off a consultation for a hair transplant because you don't live in an area that has a good hair transplant doctor, you're kind of worried about going to these hair mills where they might transect the grafts, might not give you the right result. The Hair by Air program is exactly the right thing for you. So here we are. We're actually located right next to the Twin Cities Airport. It's a major Delta hub. It flies to 170 locations. There are 16 airlines that service it. We're in visual sight of it. And what we do is we have a program. If you sign up for a virtual consultation, you decide to book a hair transplant date, we'll reimburse $200 of travel expenses. That's, gas in your car's tank. That's a ticket to fly here. We have our shuttle comes and gets you from baggage claim. We cover 2 night stay at our on-site hotel. So it's super easy. You come in the night before, get a great night's sleep, wake up, we're 10 steps outside the front door, get the hair transplant done, go back to the hotel that night. You can explore the Twin Cities, see a Vikings game or Twins game, or fly home the next day. And that's a great way where you can get world-class treatment in a super convenient manner. You don't have to compromise on that kind of quality. You can check the show notes for the Hair by Air landing page, and you can also request a free consultation using that same link. All right, so back to this.
All right, so bottom line, if somebody's seeing the title of this and they just want a straight answer, do hair transplants still look fake?
Not because of the technique anymore. So FUT and modern FUE, when done by someone who's actually trained properly and respects the anatomy, the follicular unit science in the 1980s and 90s, they can produce results that a dermatologist would struggle to spot. The problem is on that front genuinely solved.
I feel like there's a but here.
Well, like the but looks fake today is almost entirely a judgment call and experience problem. It's not really a technology problem. It's clinics that are doing FUE only, high volume, technician-driven sessions without the planning, hairline design, graft distribution, donor management for a patient's lifetime. It's that place is what's kind of causing these issues. And it's, the surgeons who actually built the field, they spent decades and decades arguing about this exact problem.
So to a patient that's maybe skeptical about doing this, it's not about trust the technology, it's vet the people using it.
That's the whole episode in one sentence.
I'll take this version. The hair transplant industry spent 40 years solving a hardware problem and is currently in the middle of a staffing problem.
Let's go ahead and use that.
Moving on to our next segment where we talk about our hair loss blog. There are new examples of technologies getting in the way of hair. We've got a blog post up right now that's a great example of how a diagnosis can get murky. It's about GLP-1 medications, Ozempic, Wegovy, those things, and the hair shedding that a lot of people don't expect a few months in.
Yeah. When I go to barbecues now, like this is the question that I get asked like dozens and dozens of times because everyone seems to be on these GLP-1s. They're seeing the effect on their hair, and it's the big topic of conversation.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I think should get discussed more when people are going on those. Like I do support those medications, but I think the hair loss side of it's a little important to talk about. So yeah, it's everywhere right now. And sometimes that shedding is temporary. It's totally reversible stress on the follicle, but sometimes rapid weight loss just unmasks male pattern or female pattern hair loss that was already quietly happening underneath the whole time.
Yeah. So people start on GLP-1s and they start seeing hair loss. Alec, what should they do?
Well, first they should read the blog and then schedule a consultation here. Links in the show notes.
Perfect. All right, so now we're going to go to our trending topic of the week,
The Florida thread?
the Florida thread. So there's a guy who's dealing with a pretty rough outcome and what he calls unethical conduct at the clinic that he went to, and it kind of blew up online this week.
Where do you land on it? Is it a legit warning or just an internet pile-on?
So I say both, and here's why. So we'll kind of bring up to speed. I'll start with the maximum fairness to the clinic in this case. The user's photos, they show a Norwood level 4 vertex. He has really dark hair and light skin, so very high color contrast, which, as you know, that's the most difficult situation to make look really dense. And so in his photos, he has the shots of pre-transplant, during the transplant, and then post. The grafts are placed in the head. They look to be placed pretty well. The hairline looks natural. It's at the right height, the right angles, and all that. There were some in the comment sections in the grafts look like they're placed too high, and that means that they'll die off. This is another case study of people who are not doctors opining about medical stuff. So in actuality, hair grafts can often protrude about 1 or so millimeters from the epidermis, and there's no real issue if it's that high.
So did he have a good result?
Well, the photos leave something to be desired. His photos were from 15 months after a 4,000 graft FUE, and then he said there were 3 months after another 2,000 graft FUE. And so, the first graft should be coming in. We don't see those second grafts. There could be a little bit of shock loss from that second procedure that makes it look a little bit, worse. A significant number of the grafts clearly took because he was bald in the transplant areas before. It's definitely not like a dense mission accomplished result. And I'd say if he hadn't had that revision, if this was just 4,000 grafts after 15 months, I would use the hair metrics that we have here in our clinic to scan his scalp, see what his ending density is. And if it was less than what we had planned upon, then he probably would qualify for some kind of free revision here.
I mean, it sounds like any good clinic, they offered that to him. So what went wrong?
So I suspect his result was thin for a number of reasons. The first is transection. So noting again that FUE extraction is a very difficult skill. We've already talked about this earlier in the show, but if the roots are nicked in the process, the hair won't grow in the new location. And so that could be one thing going on. Another factor is, how the grafts were handled during placement. If there's any trauma, if they dried out, that can also limit the size, how many hairs will take. And then let's also not forget that, 4,000 grafts is a very large procedure. And so the survival rate, can be reduced due to the capacity of the blood vessels that they have there. And also why, we don't really recommend, going that high for, most clients.
All right. Well, the internet said it's the clinic's fault, so it's the clinic's fault, right?
Well, the one thing I couldn't find in the user's comments was any mention of our old friend of the show, finasteride. And so if the user isn't taking a DHT blocker, it's possible his hair loss is progressing. And, the clinic is trying to shoot against a target that keeps them moving.
All right. So basically, I mean, this is just an unsatisfied client. Those happen sometimes. Why is this story gaining traction?
Okay, so that was all prologue, and here's the real juicy part. So in the user's telling, he posted about his experience. He got a DM from another user asking to see his photos. And then guy 1 shares those photos with this user. And within 15 minutes of providing those photos, he gets some accusatory messages from the clinic in question. So in essence, the user is alleging that the clinic catfished him into revealing his identity so that they would get him to take the reviews down. And if that's true, it's icky, it's wrong, it likely violates a lot of patient privacy, medical ethics, and HIPAA. The comments are also pretty interesting in that it's a bunch of people jumping on, immediately with here's who else to consider, which tells you the community, they already have their favorites. They're carrying a lot of water for these clinics, and they kind of half expect the narrative that there's going to be a clinic that's cutting corners that they have to jump on.
I mean, people love to jump on a bandwagon, but something about this is fishy. Some of those commenters could be just from other clinics trying to pull themselves up by tearing others down. We've seen that before. So what do you think in this case?
Well, I think that there's a lot of that, but why I chose this story is here's the juiciest part. So when I was checking this post right before our show, I saw that the clinic kept the receipts. So they deny catfishing the client, and they instead produced screenshots, had the names blacked out, so there's no PII here, but it shows that the user was demanding $6,000 from the clinic for his silence. And this is likely on top of the free revision work. So that would be extortion and defamation. And so no one here is really covering themselves in actual glory.
All right, well, sounds like there's really no winners here, but we can move on to our unanswered question of the week. It actually comes from the same thread, sort of just a loose end that never got finished up.
Let's tee this up then.
So someone replies to that Florida post saying, basically, I'm booked to go to Miami myself in December, but I can't leave the country, so I don't feel like I have any other options. One other commenter jumps in and mentions coming to Minnesota as an alternative, and then nothing. Original poster never responds, and the thread moves on.
So the actual question underneath is,
Well, if I can't or won't travel internationally, I don't trust what's near me. What do I actually do? And nobody really gave a good answer.
so what's the real answer here?
Well, that nothing near me and nothing good near me usually aren't the same problem. There are legitimate U.S. clinics, including us, not going to pretend otherwise, built specifically around the fact that most people don't have a great option in their own city. That's the entire premise behind Hair by Air. You don't have to choose between whatever's a drive away and get on a plane to another country.
So the thread died there, but the actual question was sitting just one reply with the whole time.
Pretty much, yes. And hopefully she sees this instead.
And so if our listeners have any question that they want answered, they can email podcast@abovethehairline.com. And we'll feature your questions and we'll answer it right here on our podcast.
All right. So for the record, next time I'm in the expert chair, conducting consultations for clients, et cetera, how I set them up, we can put me right back in that chair.
Excellent. Sounds like an important topic for anyone who's considering a transplant in their future.
Correct. That's the show. If today made you curious about your own donor area or hairline plan, book a consult. We'll actually look at your specific situation instead of talking in generalities for 40 minutes.
Thank you, Alec, and we'll see you all next time.
See you
Bye-bye.
next time.